That's a question for Andrea. I mean, how does this manifest itself in physical space? Because my understanding of co-working is that it started as almost as a counterculture in that regard. You know, the whole notion of co-working is that all you needed was a Wi-Fi signal, a coffee pot, your laptop, and other people to work with. That space did not matter when it came to co-working, and yet that has evolved, and your work has done that.
Right.
So how did you approach that?
When General Assembly first reached out to me, you know, actually we sat down and there was no General Assembly, there was no name. They were still formulating what the company was. You know, and they said, we're interested in you designing our office interiors. I said, well, I don't design office interiors. And we thought that was the end of the conversation, but as they started speaking and talking about what their company was trying to do, I realized very quickly that office interiors had actually nothing to do with it. You know, they're talking about bringing a whole group of different people together, some with very strong notions and visions about what their companies were, some individuals who just wanted to have the exposure, you know. And I realized very quickly that everything that they had with regards, all of their vision was antithetical to how people, at least at that time, this was 4 or 5 years ago, were designing an office. For me, the reason I always hesitated to design an office was because most of my focus was on education as well as public places. And speaking to what you were talking about empowerment, you know, people gravitate towards public spaces because they feel empowered. It's a benign space. No one owns that space per se, and so therefore, you know, in the same way that you often open up on a, you know, a wraparound porch, sitting in a porch swing, and you divulge all of your greatest secrets. You sit on the New York Public Library steps. You gather in Bryant Park. There's something about that that allows you to feel empowered and to exchange in a way that you normally would not. In terms of education, you know, at that time, people were gravitating away from children being passive receptors of information. You know, this was no longer about like the single instructor in the front just kind of filling the heads of children with information. It started to become much more interactive. They started to realize that children were learning from their peers as much as from their instructors, that every single space, you know, much beyond just the confines of the classroom, was where they were doing their learning. So when General Assembly, we started talking about the space, we said, well, let's not talk about the co-working for a moment. Let's just talk about fundamentally, why are people here? And the first answer, at least, you know, for the New York space, they've gone elsewhere since, but for the New York space was, fundamentally, people are here for New York. And so therefore, whatever we design has to connect people to the city at large. You know, the other was, and again, for General Assembly, some of the co-working spaces bring many different, but I think all of them encourage a creativity. You know, the creative profession is hard as it is. You know, no one knows, you know, more the paralyzing nature of the white paper. And so therefore, we started to talk about how do you empower people to make people feel free in their environment. And so we started breaking down, well, what is the problem with a private office? Well, a private office is all about kind of disempowering. I show up, I stand in front of a reception desk, and I wait to be acknowledged, to be checked in. And then I wait for someone else to bring me to a waiting room, and then I wait for someone else to bring me to the conference room where I've been told that's where I'm gonna meet and act a certain way and conduct a certain meeting. And you know, then I think again about the city. I think that Starbucks and all those kind of third place, not work, not home, work not just because they happen to, by default, provide those kinds of resources and Wi-Fi, but again, because they didn't seem to be technically kind of owned. You know, you and I meet, and we're kind of on common ground, and that opens up a whole possibility for exchange. So, you know, we started to say, well, what is it about the city that makes it dynamic, that makes it in that same empowering way? And it's because you have an immediate understanding of your entire environment, that you can choose kind of how to negotiate between the space, how to find the space that works for you. And, you know, so from day 2, after day 1, I realized, you know, I could cross it off the list and need not have to design office interiors. Day 2 was, well, let's talk about what it is we're doing from a programming level. You know, it's not office, it's not conference room, it's not meeting space, it's, you know, none of those terms apply anymore. It's this gradation, this thousands of different activities that exist because, one, we're having to deal with a group of individuals who don't have the common goal. They don't have the single kind of corporate logo and focused on a singular mission, they're working differently. Even the same individual, none of us work the same way every day. So how do you create a spectrum of opportunities that allow you to be a different person, that opens yourself up for that kind of exchange? So from a kind of more concrete answer to like how that ties into the space as a whole, and I think it goes to what James mentioned about the 86% who, here are these young tech startups all somehow residing in pre-war buildings. Fundamentally, they're drawn to the fact that there's an authenticity to the New York fabric. Maybe it's because technology is so virtual in some regard and so fleeting that there's a certain comfort in having a physical space that represents a certain permanence. Again, probably why a lot of us are here is we love the idea that someone hands us a key and we're an automatic New Yorker. But I think that they really wanted to be rooted in the city as a whole, not just kind of hermetically contained. And so therefore the physical space becomes something that is much more an urban plan, more a Noli map, with moments that are defined and heavily programmed, but at the same time, for the most part, it's flows. It's going to look more like a subway map or a transportation map than a compartmentalized interiors plan.
I think we all sympathize with that. That's very similar to my experience as well. I mean, really, we see that this kind of crossing over where the city is becoming a workplace as a whole, and the workplace is becoming like a city, right? So like inside your actual workspace that you're designing, it has all the kind of multiple activities that you expect in a city, and that's what makes it so stimulating in the same way that we find the city so stimulating. You think back to like the Situationists from like the 60s and how the city is the new city, the media city is such a stimulating place that makes you, it stimulates all your thoughts and creativity. And you try to create that kind of feeling in the work environment by creating different kinds of places, especially because a lot of us are designing spaces for people who are in various kinds of creative activities, not just tech, but in all kinds of different creative endeavors. And you don't want to work in the same place. You don't want to always work in the same kind of seating, the same kind of environment. So you create, like in a city, there's zoning. You have like quiet zones, and that gradients to a louder zone. You have areas that are dense and areas that are more diffuse. You have areas that are darker, it screens as more of like an editing room, and areas that are brighter for people who want more of like a, kind of a bright reading kind of area. So, by creating all these different kinds of zones, you're creating, it's not like the old school of designing an office. And my first job out of architecture school was working in a place that did corporate offices, and did not last very long. But it's like, okay, here's the office, then you just pick out the fabrics and the coverings, all this kind of stuff. And we kind of get away from that and more towards a kind of urban designing kind of feel. At the same time, as you just said also, the city flips around and becomes more of a workplace, because anywhere you go, you can create a workplace wherever you are.
Yeah, and I think that the nomadic nature of these tech groups, the fact that it's not just a matter of creating co-working spaces within the different cities, but that the fact that it's a launching pad and people are able to kind of go and work when they're just in a city for a small period of time. The reason why it's so interesting how the cities are being transformed, or the notion of the office space is being transformed, is because when you go and you travel, and of course before you start traveling for work you think it's very romantic and you love the idea of going to different cities, and you realize very quickly, you come back and people say, well, how was Los Angeles? And you have no idea, because you were in a conference room with drop ceilings and fluorescent lighting. And the idea now that because some of these co-working spaces are embracing and integrating with the city, it actually gives you this authentic sense. It gives you a real place to be. So when you do visit a General Assembly in Los Angeles or different these co-working spaces in different cities, you actually get a flavor for that.